Well, welcome everyone to this AMA with Nate Barbettini. Nate is the co-founder and CTO of a company called Cobbler and is a web security enthusiast. He previously worked at Okta and he's focusing on better SDKs for OpenID, Connect, and Okta's APIs. Let everybody watching this video let us know a little bit more about you, what you're working, and probably tell us a little bit more about your life as a student. As you might be aware of, today we have students from all over the world joining, and these are community leaders or people who are helping other students learn the technologies that probably you don't learn at school. So yeah, let us know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's probably a great place to start. I had kind of a unusual, I would say unusual path as a student. I was through primary school, I was homeschooled. So a lot of my education was kind of self-directed. My parents kind of just like gave me a stack of books to read and I just read them. Mostly the ones I was interested in, less the ones I wasn't interested in. But then when I got to like secondary education, I did a degree in computer science, but I actually did that online. So a lot of it was still like there was an official curriculum and stuff and a syllabus, but a lot of it was still like self-directed. I had to learn the pieces on my own. I could ask the professors for help or questions or whatever, but a lot of it was still like myself trying to learn it. And I realized that that's definitely not the education path that most people take. But what I think was valuable, and I think is relevant also to really any students, is that there's always stuff that you're going to be taught by a professor or a teacher or somebody, but then that's really only like a percentage of the value of like your education or learning something. It's also only a percentage of the effort of learning something, because I think one of the most valuable things you can learn is the ability, the skill to learn something on your own, or learn something like mostly on your own with help from people. But because once you kind of get out of university or college or trade school or whatever whatever you start in, once you get out of that, once you get into working in a job or starting your own company or whatever you're doing, there's all sorts of other skills that you need to learn, or that you've only have like this much from school and you need to learn the rest of it, right? And there's not going to be a professor telling you, okay, read chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, or there's not going to be somebody saying there's going to be a test about this at the end of the semester. You have to figure out how to like learn that stuff on your own. So I think it's super valuable, whether you're like, no matter what your kind of education path looks like, it's super valuable to learn that skill of having to figure things out on your own. So to bring it back to your question about like how I got started, I think that's one of the things that really was valuable for me as I was learning and going through school. After school, I started a job as like doing programming, like junior developer at a company. Learned a ton, got to like stretch my skills a ton, and then ultimately like jumped over to a pretty small startup that was doing web security stuff, which I hadn't done. So that was like intimidating for sure, because I didn't know a lot of the things that people were talking about. They're starting to talk about Oauth, and I'm like, I think I know what that is, but I don't really. New stuff. I worked there for a couple of years, and then that company got acquired by Okta, which is now a pretty big company. They weren't quite as big at the time, but now they're a lot bigger. And I was there for a couple of years, stretched my skills and learned a bunch of other things that I hadn't seen before. And then just last year, I decided to quit Okta and start my own company with a coworker from Okta to solve a different problem that we saw, that we kind of saw nobody out in the marketplace was building software to really solve this particular problem well. So we thought, you know what, why not give it a shot and try to build something that would be really useful here.
I think that's a very interesting story, and going a little bit back about the way that you got involved into coding and being homeschooled. Do you think that influenced the way that you learn to code or the way that you see college, and how you just probably, like, instead of only consuming content, also try to find out or deep dive into these topics?
Yeah, it definitely influenced me. I think the biggest thing that influenced me was at a pretty early age, I had a lot of freedom to just be like, oh, I'm super interested in coding. I'm just going to like read a ton of books about that and learn it. And I didn't really have anyone telling me, oh, you have to go do this now. It was just like, I was really interested in it. So, and my parents were, I guess, happy to see that I was really interested in something. So they're like, sure, you can keep doing that. But it definitely, that experience of like learning something, effectively teaching myself, learning coding. This is, back before, I feel like it's so much easier now. This is back before YouTube and before Stack Overflow and before before Google. So this is like reading it, having to read like an 800-page book and try to understand what you're learning from that. It definitely influenced how I approach problem solving in coding today, because it is easier now. There's a lot more resources available now, but at the end of the day, you still have to you're going to get into something where you don't really know what's going on, or it's like new, you haven't done this before. And so you have to try something, doesn't work, read about it, figure out, okay, why didn't it work? There's some other things I need to learn, try that, kind of iterate and do an iterative learning process. That's like true pretty much anywhere. So getting comfortable with that, I think, is a very really valuable skill to have.
Yeah, and going back or starting your journey as a developer and how you got involved with Oauth, I do believe that Oauth is one of those technologies that when you face it for the first time, it doesn't seem to be a very friendly, documented technology. How did you end up getting around that?
So yeah, it's very unfriendly. And there's kind of there's like a backstory. There's a reason for that. It's almost one of those things where once you fully understand what Oauth is trying to do and like the problem that it was built to solve, then it kind of makes sense why it works the way it does. But if you don't know that and you're just trying to come in and be like, okay, someone told me I have to learn this Oauth thing, what is it? It's just like, so there's so much jargon and there's so much like technical like nuance about it. Also, unfortunately, because the spec itself, the Oauth like paper, is very opinions on how it should be implemented, which is really confusing, especially when you're just trying to like understand what it does. How I got involved with it is, like I said, I joined a company that was doing web security, like authentication, authorization stuff. So Oauth was a big part of what they did. And I didn't really know anything about it. So I started with like literally the basics of understanding like how the different flows worked, building servers and like building examples that used it to try to piece it together in my mind to see how it works. But like, I would be lying if I said that I picked it up overnight. It probably took me like a year of playing with it off and on and like reading about it and understanding it before I personally had like that light bulb moment. I was like, oh, okay, now I understand how this is supposed to work. And even after that, there were still things like I misunderstood about it. And then it was helpful to be around a lot of other people who were like very knowledgeable and expert in this topic, because then I was like, if I said something wrong, they were like, "Oh no, that's not how it's supposed to work. It's different." So yeah, it took me a while. I ended up ultimately like the talk that a lot of people have probably seen that's on YouTube that I published a couple years ago. That I like 50% of me writing that talk was just for myself, like so I could make sure that I understood it right. And I wanted to put together something that like, now that I think I understand it, this is how I wish someone had explained it to me a year ago, and it would have been a lot easier for me to understand if they put it this way. I think ultimately one of the things that's so confusing about the topic is that most of the tutorials or talks or explanations about it kind of like, they like explain it to you as if you already understand it, instead of explaining it to you from a blank slate. Like, okay, from the beginning, what is this thing supposed to do? Instead, they kind of come at it from like the opposite, saying, yeah, like, let's go into the super nitty gritty of how this works because you already understand the why. And that's the part that I felt was missing, at least for how I was trying to learn it early on.
So it seems like you also tried to learn the technology while you were giving talks and explaining it to others. And then your career started to become kind of like more of a developer advocate, not only for Okta, but also for Oauth. How did you get started? Because I mean, a lot of students here are also teaching other students how to code something new or how to use a certain technology. What was your path into advocating for Oauth and advocating for Okta?
My path towards that was kind of accidental, actually. When I joined Stormpath, which is the company I was at right before Okta, the role that I joined was actually I wasn't just a developer. I was specifically a developer advocate, and I hadn't even heard about that type of job before I joined that company. But it was really interesting to me because before I got into coding, I've always really liked teaching. So I was really lucky early on in my schooling career and in college and stuff to have a couple of teachers who were just really, really good at explaining difficult things. And that really stuck with me because I would be struggling with something, especially like math is something I struggled with really, really badly in like primary and secondary school. It didn't click with me at first. I was struggling with like pre-calculus and it just didn't make sense. And I had some teachers who were just really good at saying, okay, like, don't worry about all that complicated stuff. Like, start with this. Here's how this works. Try it this way and do it like this. And then I would be like, okay, this is starting to make sense. So that really made an impression on me, like how rewarding it can be to help somebody else kind of have that light bulb moment. So I actually did some, like, as a side job when I was in school, I did some tutoring, like math and computer science stuff, just helping people who are just getting started and super confused, like helping them, working with them one-on-one to help them understand some of these concepts. So I found that I really liked that. So then when this job came up, that was like, part of this job is you're going to be writing code, and then part of this job is you have to give talks and like teach other people and help them understand how to write code. That was really interesting to me. I was like, wow, I didn't even know that was a job that you could do. So that's kind of how I got started in that. And then it just led to me doing like more and more talks, more and more like writing blog posts, tutorials. I ended up like creating some video courses and like lots of learning materials. And I kind of, from that experience that I had early on of feeling what it was like to be frustrated because I didn't understand, like I didn't feel like I had an explanation that really started from the ground up. Remembering what that frustration felt like, I've tried to always keep that in mind when I was writing talks or tutorials or whatever, and say like, look, even if you're coming in with like zero understanding of this, that's okay. We'll like build up all the building blocks you need to understand this particular topic. Sometimes it was effective. Sometimes there were like 3 people in the audience for my talk. But it was really good experience, and I really liked the ability to like help people by teaching them something that maybe they're confused by.
Yeah, and well, it seems that after that you started creating a more structured content, such as your little ASP.NET book. You become a Microsoft MVP. Can you tell us how was, because the .NET book, it's open source, if I'm not wrong, or it's freely, or it's open for everyone to access?
Yeah, Creative Commons license, and it's all the whole book is just on GitHub. So yeah, open source.
And why did you decide to start a book? And open source is for everyone to have access for it when, I mean, you were already probably starting to get paid for teaching others, right? And that could be like a career that you could follow for. Why opening or creating a book, and why having it under Creative Commons?
I've always kind of wanted to write a book, but it's a lot of work to write a big book. I actually, part of the backstory there is I actually was talking to one of the big publishers about writing like a real book that would be sold, and I ended up actually spending a lot of time writing like a big table of contents and kind of this big proposal about what would this like 400 or 500 page ASP.NET Core book look like. This is like early on when ASP.NET Core was like 1.0. And I was excited about that project, but it also, like, realistically looking at the timeline, I'm like, this is going to take like 18 to 24 months of my life to work on this. Plus I have a day job, and I was also getting married at that time. I was like, I don't really want, like, this seems like a lot of work for like my first year of marriage plus a new job. Like, it's exciting, but I don't know if I want to do this right now. So I ended up declining. Like, I ended up saying, sorry, I didn't really have the time to do this right now. Like, have someone else write this book. But it stuck with me, like, man, it would be cool to share some of this knowledge. So I decided, instead of spending 2 years working on a huge book that would be like 600 pages long, why not? I have a lot of this knowledge already. Why don't I just spend like a weekend writing a short book? And it's like, I don't want to charge money for it or anything. It's more that I would like to see people who are interested in learning this framework that's kind of new. A lot of people are familiar with Node or Python, but they're not as familiar with C#, or they think like, oh, that's just a big enterprise, like old language that nobody uses anymore. But what I was seeing is like, wow, there's some really exciting stuff going on in open source with .NET Core and how Microsoft is kind of pivoting to open source. So nobody really has like good materials on it yet. It's pretty early. Why don't I just put something together that's really short, pretty easy, kind of assumes that you don't have any prior knowledge, and give it away for free. If it's Creative Commons, maybe more people will, remix it or print it or turn it into something else or whatever. For me, it was more just about like raising the awareness of .NET Core as a cool technology that I think should maybe get a better coverage than it already has. And it seemed to be pretty successful in doing that. A lot of people seemed to like it, and it actually made it on the front page of Hacker News for like half a day, which is kind of cool. It's been pretty successful. The only thing that's frustrating about it is that now it's kind of outdated, and it's a lot of work to like update it every time a new version comes out. And so I still need to find some time to do that.
Yeah. So let's start talking more about Oauth and getting more technical in that side. Kevin asked, before choosing any authentication or authorization flow that is going to be scalable, what should you consider?
That it's a broad question, so let me start with like maybe a few different things to think about. So I think it's important to separate what are the goals or the needs of the application. For some applications, it's just, I need people to be able to sign in. For some applications, it's like, I need people to be able to sign in with a username and password, and also I want them to be able to click, sign in with Google or sign in with Apple or something. And maybe that's for some applications or projects, that's it. For others, it's like, yeah, once you sign in, now there's going to be this, a complicated permission system where if you're an admin, you can do this, but if you're a reader, you can only do that. And if you're something else, you have a free account versus a paid account or whatever. A lot of that gets complicated, not because it's like extremely hard necessarily, but it's because it is very different depending on the needs of the application. So there's kind of like, there's not a one size fits all solution for a lot of those things. Many languages and frameworks have they'll have building blocks for those, like a permissions object or a way to set, like, depending on certain claims that the user has, then determine their permissions or whatever. But you still have to wire a lot of that together yourself, because it really just depends on what your application needs. in terms of how you should think about scalability, so I would say one thing that, or first I would say that using something like OAuth or OpenID Connect is really, I would think about that as it's like a particular solution to a particular problem. It's like one tool in the toolbox. If you have, it's a hammer if you have nails that you need to hit. But if you have screws, you need a screwdriver, not a nail. So I think a lot of people, because it's so popular online, a lot of people just assume like that's what I need to build authorization for my application. But it's not necessarily. Like for some applications, it's perfectly fine to just have like a login form, and then you set a session cookie for that user session, and that's it. You don't have to worry about OpenID Connect and all these flows and stuff. Now, if it's important for you to do like social login, or it's important for you to have multiple applications that have a single centralized like authentication mechanism, and you do single sign-on across them, now you're talking more, it makes sense to do like OpenID Connect. But the scalability part is really that a lot of that really depends on the application itself. The final thing I'll say there is that one thing I do like about OpenID Connect, or just thinking about like a protocol to separate the application from the authentication piece, that can be nice for scalability, because regardless of whether you're using OpenID Connect or something else, but let's say you use OpenID Connect, what it does is it forces apart the application and the authentication mechanism. So really they could be separate services, or even separate technologies or whatever. The protocol is just kind of the glue between them. So that can help with scalability, in the sense that if you need to scale up the authentication piece to like handle more user logins or whatever, that could be done separately than scaling up the main application. But to kind of round that out, I would say a lot of times it is important to think about scalability when you're starting in a project, but it's not the most important thing. It's very easy to like over-engineer for, what if this gets 1 million users, but right now you only have 2. So like probably better spend time on like building the features that were going to get you to 1 million users, rather than like worrying about that type of scale at the beginning. It's a tricky balance. I know that was kind of a long, rambling answer to that question, but if there's any more specific pieces that we want to touch on, I can definitely do so.
No, but I think you're absolutely right in trying to build the scalability from the beginning of an app or a new startup. Probably is not the core need at that time. You can get into some technical depth at the beginning just to make sure that you start getting an audience and you start building the application that will actually provide the benefit for your clients or your users, and then start working about scalability. I know it's scalability is something that it's not like an event, but it's a process. So it requires to be constantly changing as your application starts growing, and you'll find new needs in terms of not only user needs, but also in terms of what your application would require to handle that amount of users. And
yes, if I can add one more thing to that, it's really, I think it actually, in some ways, it gets too much of a focus a lot of times, because like, if you're on Hacker News, for example, a lot of the top stories are going to be like, we ran into huge scaling problems because we didn't use DynamoDB the right way, and then it's like, our application hit a wall and we couldn't scale to 200 million users or something. Those are like those types of stories and what people talk about when they talk about scaling are really interesting. But that's really like the second problem to the first problem, which is like, are you building something that 200 million people are going to want to use? And a lot of times, like, that's the hardest thing to figure out. Once you're getting tons of users or a huge amount of load, your application it'll tell you where the scaling problems are. Like your database is going to be crashing, or request timeouts are going to happen, or whatever. It'll be clear then. So I would say it's very easy to over-engineer that early on.
Yeah, I just remember a chapter on, I don't know if you've read the book An Elegant Puzzle, which is from the Stripe Press. Very highly recommended for anyone
I'll
to
check it out.
read. They have a cycle for any project. So first you build the feature, then you start getting into a point where you need to start planning. If it grows, then you start hiring new people to help you maintain that feature. Then you optimize the feature, and then you start the cycle again, right? So that you create new features and make it sustainable, maintainable. Then you can, they call it slacking. So you can slack to create new features, or to start thinking about new features that you can build on top of that. So that's a great cycle for projects to grow and maintain the user base without creating features that you probably just like launch once and then forget about them eternally.
Yeah.
And one question that we got as well is, when did you decide to build your own custom authorization tools, and when should you use external authorization ones such as Google or Facebook or one of the other ones that are already built? When do you profit from each of these?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it comes back to where it starts is what is the user experience that you want to have? Because it's a very different user experience, say, to go to an app or an application, and the first thing you see is like a sign in with Google button. That can be really easy for users. Like, that's easy for me if I'm signing up for something new, and all I have to do is click on like sign in with Google. Awesome. But it also, like, there's a trade-off, because it also, you know, leaves out people who don't have a Google account or don't like Google or don't like Facebook or whatever. So I would say, like, it's not necessarily a question of which one is better. Like, is it better to build it all in-house, or is it better to rely on Google for your authentication, or something else like Okta or Auth0? A lot of it just comes down to, like, first, what are you trying to build? Are you building like a consumer experience where you want people to be able to sign up in 2 seconds by just signing in with Facebook or Google or something? Do you want people to be able to, instead of doing that, do you want them to be able to use a username and password or an email and password to sign in? Or maybe just an email? Like, Slack kind of popularized the idea of, you just put your email in, you get a magic link from the email, you click that, you're logged in. What's the security level that you want to have? Like, are you building a bank? Probably should have something more robust than just an email. But if you're just building, like, you know, if you're just building something to store a to-do list, or you're in bookmarks or something, like, maybe it could be a little bit less secure, in the sense that if someone, I don't know, if someone guessed your password or something, like, maybe it's not the end of the world. Those are all things to think about as you're building. First, just kind of like figuring out what the user experience would be.
Yeah, and talking a little bit more about OpenID Connect and Oauth, which are the difference that you see between both? Because they normally get confused by folks that they're the same thing. So what is the difference between both?
Yes, they get very confused, and part of that reason isn't just that people are confused, it's that the specs themselves are very confusing. So if you find them confusing, like, you're not alone. That they're not written in the most clear way. What the easiest way to understand it is that OAuth came first, and OAuth was built to solve a very specific problem. Not talking about authentication, don't think about like logging into something. Instead, think about, what do you need, or what does it look like to be able to say, I have data in one system, let's say it's your Google Photos in your Google account, and I have something in another system that wants to get to that data. So a great example is, like, you have Google Photos stored in Google, and you want to send them to some like photo printing service that's going to print them out on a nice like photo printer and mail them to you. Now, you could, of course, download all those files and then like upload them manually to the photo printing website, but it's way easier if you could just click a button on the photo printer website. It goes over to Google and says, hey, I'm not trying to get access to all of your email and calendar and like everything else you have in your Google account, all your Google Drive files and stuff. All I want to do is I just want to get like read-only access to your photos. I'm not going to delete them. I just literally just want to read them. Maybe only one album or something very small in scope. That the ability to do that or you could replace that with, you know, anything else where you want to get a little bit of access, like something like Calendly gets limited access to your Google Calendar, so it can create new calendar events automatically for you in Google Calendar without you having to do it. But of course, it can't like go delete your email or nuke all your Drive files or something. So the idea of being able to get a little bit of access from one system to another in like an agreed upon way, where Calendly didn't have to build a very, you know, specific custom integration, or they didn't have to like work together with Google to build a Google Calendar integration, and my photo printer service didn't have to build to go talk to the Google guys and say like, give us a special way of accessing the photos on this user's account. It's standardized in the sense that Google just says, we support this protocol called Oauth. If you're building something and you want to connect to do one of these things, here are the protocol mechanisms that you use to create a button that takes you over to Google and asks the user, can I do X, Y, Z? And if the user says yes, it takes you back and you get a connection there. That's all Oauth is. And it's super useful because it gives an ability for different systems to agree on kind of the language or the protocol that they're going to use to talk to each other and exchange this information. Now, could it be a little bit less confusing in how it does that? Definitely. But that's what Oauth is about in terms of specifically authorization. What you're doing is authorizing Calendly to say, Calendly, you are allowed to access my calendar, but that's it. Now, what happened was Oauth kind of became a victim of its own success in a way. It became so popular and so well adopted, which is a good thing, that then when like 2012 or whenever people started doing social login, Facebook, Google, a bunch of other guys said like, hey, you don't have to have a password and an email on every website. Just like kind of use the fact that you already have a Google account, or use the fact that you already have a Facebook account. Because Oauth was so popular, they ended up just kind of reusing the Oauth protocol to make those buttons work, which makes it extra confusing because now we're talking about authentication, logging in, not authorization, which is like, what are you allowed to do once you're already logged in? So that became extra confusing because now if people talk about Oauth, they might be talking about authorization, kind of the original use case, or they might be talking about this hacky way of doing authentication that was invented to make social login work. And by social login, I just mean like sign in with Facebook button. So if we fast forward a couple of years, then OpenID Connect was created as really just like a thin layer on top of the Oauth protocol. It doesn't try to reinvent anything. It's just saying like, okay, we already have these mechanisms for different flows and redirects and stuff in Oauth. Clearly it can work for authentication because people are already using it all over the place for all these social login buttons. So why don't we just standardize it, and we'll call it OpenID Connect, and that will just be used for authentication, not for authorization. So to make a long answer now very short, authorization, if you're trying to solve use cases involving authorization, like you're building a Calendly or you're building a photo printer service or something else that needs to go get some information from Facebook or Google or something that supports Oauth, basically building integrations, you're probably going to be working with Oauth. If you are instead building something where you want to do authentication, where you're saying, I want users to be able to log in using some mechanism, whether that mechanism is because they have a Google account or because they have an Amazon account, or anybody who supports OpenID Connect, basically saying that your application trusts some other service to authenticate a user, you're talking about OpenID Connect. So it's really like you might use one or the other or both in an application. It depends on what you're working on.
So some of the folks who are watching this would like to start working with Oauth and OpenID Connect. Do you know where they can start to learn more about these technologies, and which would be like a cool first project to build to get familiarized with the technology?
A really good first project to build would be like, I would say starting small and building something like build something that uses Oauth to do some cool integration to something like Google or Facebook. Like if you use Google, maybe you use Google Calendar or you use Google Photos, look through their documentation and see the different Oauth scopes, or basically permission requests that they support. And you can, like, with not too much code, you could build something that you connect to like an application that you connect to your Google account, and then it just like pulls out your 5 most recent photos and shows them to you, or tells you like what the next day calendar agenda looks like. Like, here's a summary of your calendar, and then maybe it like emails it to you automatically or something like that. Or I don't know, reads it out to you on your Amazon Echo device or whatever. But building like small integrations like that and understanding is a really good way to understand how OAuth works and kind of the problem that it's trying to solve. Similarly, if you're interested in learning about OpenID Connect, a great start there is just to build something where the authentication mechanism is like a sign in with Google button, and when someone, an anonymous visitor lands on your application, they click that button, it prompts them, it like takes them over to Google, prompts them to log in, bring them back, and they're now logged into your application, and your application is able to pull in their name, email address, maybe some information about them like their birthday or something based on their Google profile. That's a great way to start to understand how the authentication flow works. And then some of the like technical details, the fact that you need an ID token, and the ID token has a particular structure, and it's going to have certain values in it, and you can read those values in your application, etc.
Awesome.
Overall, I would say starting small is the best way to go, because it can be a confusing topic. So the smaller you can start with something that's like nice and scoped down, no pun intended, is a great way to start.
Yeah, and I would say that for one of the most common mistakes that I've seen at hackathons is people dedicating too much time to build a register or a sign up form for their apps, and probably not showing some of the features that their application might that these features that will solve some of the problems that they're trying to go through, right? Or to solve. So
I would also add to that and say, like, just because OAuth and OpenID Connect are like, popular or people talk about them a lot, doesn't necessarily mean that it's what you need to start with in your own application as well. In many cases, it might be more complicated to try to get OAuth or OpenID Connect in an application if it doesn't really need it. Like, if you're building something really small, the understanding just the super basic level of basic API authentication with a header, or a simple like login form that then like sets a cookie on the server and creates a session for the user. Those are things that are kind of boring in the sense that they've been done, for 10 or 20 years now. It's nothing new or exciting, but that can be a great place to start as well, because if you I think it's easier to understand these more advanced authentication concepts if you have played with the basics and understand, like, okay, yeah, I understand I understand how to get a user logged in with just like a cookie. Then taking it to the next level and saying, okay, if I plug in social login on top of this, how does this affect it?
Sure. And talking about starting a project, we got questions about how do you start with your startup in terms of not only the story behind it, but when you start to plan and start to know what are your user needs, and what has been different for you after being a developer, now being a CTO of a company, might have much more responsibilities.
Yes. On the first question, it's always, I don't know, it's always really exciting and also really hard at the beginning of a project to figure out what is the important things for this project to do, whether you're talking about building like a small tool that's only for your own use, or if you're trying to build something big for a ton of users. For me, how I typically approach that, especially for like hobby projects and stuff, is it's easiest for me to build something when I am myself in the target audience. Like, oh, I really wish something existed that did X. Well, nothing really does it well. Oh, I'll just build one myself because I understand, like I am also a user, so I understand what the user would want. That's always really fun and exciting because if you're building something that you yourself can use, then it can be really rewarding to, build it and then use it yourself. I still use, I built a small tool called OpenID Connect Debugger when I was trying to figure out this OpenID Connect stuff. And I just put it, I put it online running in a cheap container. And for a long time, I think I was the only user of it. And I still am one of the users of it, but now a lot of other people use it too because they found it useful. In terms of on a bigger level, starting a software company, or really any company, that's it. I spent my co-founder and I actually spent a really long time, probably almost a year or more before we actually before we quit our jobs and started doing it full time. We were experimenting with building an MVP, and even before that, doing interviews with tons of people to understand, okay, we think we know what the problem is here, but a lot of times when you dig into a problem, you realize the actual problem is somewhere else. What people are experiencing feels bad in this area, but the root of the problem is actually 3 steps behind that because the data isn't being, the data is not being processed right, or the business process is wrong, or humans are bad at remembering things or whatever. That might be the actual problem behind it. So we spent a long time trying to talk to as many people as we could and figure out, okay, is this a problem? First of all, is this as real of a problem as we seem to think it is? And 2, is it a problem that software can fix? Because not everything is. Some things are people problems or organizational problems or whatever. And then 3, is this a problem is it a big enough problem that people will pay us to solve it? And that's not always, if you're building something, a hobby project, or you're building something open source, that may not be a consideration at all. But if you're trying to build a company that can, eventually be profitable and continue on without people donating money to it or whatever, it's important to understand some problems unfortunately are annoying, but not so annoying that someone will pay money for it. And you see that a lot of times with many startups, cool idea, super crazy AI, blockchain, whatever thing. But then 3 years later, they have a bunch of free users, but nobody's upgrading to the pro plan, or nobody's paying $10 a month to actually use it. Because it's at the end of the day, yeah, I can live with my text not being categorized, or my emojis not being automatic or whatever. I'm not actually going to pay money for it. So thinking about building a company where we want to, we want the company to be viable long term and be able to hire people and be able to be around for more than a year. Understanding that it's a big enough problem that someone will pay real dollars to solve it means that you have to make sure that it's a real problem and that it's painful enough, and from a business point of view, you can make that business case to say, okay, it's not just that you want to solve this problem, but solving this problem will save you money because maybe you aren't wasting so much time, you aren't wasting people's time working on this thing, manual data entry or whatever. So this will this is a no-brainer to buy this software because it'll directly save you money in the long term, or being able to make some business case like that. So it took us a while to get to the point where we felt like we could check all those boxes and say, yeah, this makes sense.
Cool. And going back to one part of the question that we're very interested is, how different is being a developer from being a CTO at a company or at any startup?
It's a lot different in some ways, and in other ways it's not too much different. I guess the stage that our company is at, that Cobbler is at right now, is still pretty early. So we have a team of 4 developers, including myself. So if we had a team of 400 developers, I'm sure that I probably wouldn't be still coding every day. But right now I'm still coding every day because we don't have that many people, and we just got to get features done, and we got to get stuff built. So I like that, because I think if I wasn't coding at least some of the time, I would really miss it a lot, because I really like writing code, solving problems, fixing tricky things. I like that part of it. the extra things that are very different versus just being a developer is that there's just so many more things that you have to think about. You're not just, your job isn't just to write code to solve some problem or write code to, get some ticket done and move on to the next ticket. There is, of course, plenty of problems to solve, but a lot of the problems are people problems. Like, how do we hire the right people? How do we make sure that, like, hiring someone new hiring the fifth person onto a team of 4 is like, growing it by 20%. So if you hire the wrong person, that could really throw off the, if you hire someone who's really a jerk or who's really hard to work with or doesn't, isn't a good team player, that would, it could ruin the vibe of the whole team. So making sure that you hire people who are going to vibe well with the team and obviously who are good at solving problems and stuff, that's totally different problem, very different than fixing coding problems. Making sure that customers, as your paying customers, are getting the things that they need, which are not always software related. Sometimes they want to hear someone talk to them and tell them about how their data is secure, and they're not going to be in the news because of a data breach because they trusted your system instead of somebody else's. Having the compliance checkboxes checked, like we're following the right coding practices, all that stuff, those are totally different problems. And in some ways, investors, our company is like investor backed, so we have investors who gave us money to get started. That's kind of another customer in a way, because they're not a customer of the software, but they're a customer of, they want to make sure, are you on track? Are we going to hit these goals that we talked about? Or do we need to make any changes so that we hit those goals? It's stuff's changing all the time. So there's just a lot more stuff to think about. And I kind of miss the days where it's kind of nice to only have to think about writing code. Kind of miss that. But there's a lot of, at the end of the day, it's also a lot of just different interesting problems to solve.
Yeah. And I don't know what I think managing a team, it can be kind of complex at some point. Sometimes computers, you'll code them, and if you follow the right methods, they will do what you want them to do, right? But when you're managing other people and other teams, you have to consider there's probably not the best context in the world right now, and people need to take more time. So managing people can be complex.
I feel like it would be so easy if people acted like machines. It would be so easy. But of course, people aren't machines. It would. Yes. People are not machines. So people have they have emotions and they have goals of their own, and they it takes communication, especially when you're like a remote team like we are. It takes a lot of communication to just make sure everyone's on the same page and nobody, everyone knows where we're going, and it's really hard.
I agree. And managing, I would say, and this is something we talked about with one of our campus experts yesterday, that management is the mix of scientific, which is metrics and measuring things, and art, which has to do with these people and things and goals and objectives sometimes don't have a clear structure to achieve. We're reaching the end of our webinar and AMA for today. So what tips would you have for students these days to be the developer they want to be, or to learn new things?
I can go a little bit over time too, if you want to, but tips for students today. I think there's so much material online, learning material online, whether it's on YouTube or free courses or books or whatever. I feel like there's the opportunity to learn new things is incredibly huge. And sometimes that can be overwhelming too, because sometimes you might be I don't even know where to start. I think one of the biggest opportunities is just getting, you can think about learning things as you can either spread out your knowledge horizontally, or you can go vertically, in the sense that you can go horizontal and learn lots of things about lots of different technologies, or different languages or whatever, or you can go vertical and learn really deeply one thing. It's hard to do both. What I find is a good way to think about it is to pick something that you're interested in learning and try to build something using that. So like if you're really interested in learning machine learning, for example, build a project that goes deep on that. But if you're saying, well, I don't even know, I'm not sure what it is I'm really interested in, like what do I pick? Then that's a great time to try lots of little experiments and kind of like expand your horizontal knowledge and try lots of things. Eventually something you're going to be like, wow, this is really interesting, that like I like this way more than the other stuff I've done. And then you can think, maybe I could go kind of deep on this and explore it. Ultimately, for me, I'm sure this is probably true for others, but for me, the number one best way of learning something, or actually there's two really good ways of learning something. One is to build something that's not just like hello world, but something that's actually useful, like some small tool or some project or something that you could use yourself or that your friends could use or something, even if it's small. Having to kind of build something that in your life cycle, like starting from scratch, building something, then like deploying it, putting it on the internet, or publishing it to the app store or whatever you're doing. That whole life cycle of kind of building something all the way to the end is extremely useful, because you learn so much stuff, even not just the coding stuff, but like what does it take to actually publish something? What does it take to get it on the app store and then monitor it after the fact or update it or whatever? So that's one way to get really, really knowledgeable about something. The other way is to teach other people, because there's nothing like having to give a talk or a lesson to somebody to really make sure that like you understand it yourself. So those are two really good ways of learning stuff. Ultimately, like the ability to learn new things or pick up new technologies quickly is extremely valuable, because that's basically all you do in a job, is like either come up to speed on something you don't know yet, or take something you do know and then apply it to like a new area that you haven't done before. That's like 90% of like working as a developer.
Sure, and totally agree with when you get to a new job, probably there's a thing called ramping up, right? Which is understanding how the business works and how the company works. Probably ramping up as soon as you can and getting involved with as many people in the company as you can, getting to know what their interests are and how you can align your company goals with their company goals. It's a great way to start just like learning how a company works and start growing your influence inside of an organization. Talking a little bit about the MVP program, Campus Experts is kind of like similar or a junior version of what Microsoft's MVP program would be. How does being part of that program help you out in your professional development, or to connect with people that you find very valuable in your career?
Mm-hmm. It definitely helps, both in terms of like adding, I guess you could say, like some authority to stuff that I create or that I write. It's kind of like a humble brag, I guess, but it's nice to say like, I wrote this book and I'm a Microsoft MVP, so I know what I'm talking about. You should consider that when you can think like maybe you should read my book or something like that. That's nice. The other, I guess, the other thing that's really valuable is the networking opportunity, where you're able to get connected to other people who are MVPs or campus experts in your case. And a lot of times they might be thinking about some of the same problems that you are, or maybe they've already gone through some of the same problems that you're currently going through. So I would say, like, from a career perspective, it's valuable more as like what I was trying to say before, is it's valuable as like kind of a validation of your skills or of your ability. that you can, you know, put on your resume or put on your CV. That's nice. But being able to network with other people or be able to like, yeah, I know a couple people I can just email if I run into this issue or I'm stuck on something, that can be super valuable.
Great.
And
well,
I would say that it's don't take that for granted. It's really easy to take that for granted, and for me as well. Like I've made a few connections that have been really valuable from like the Microsoft MVP program, but now I was busy at the time, and now I wish I had made more, or I wish I would start making more now. So definitely don't take that for granted. It feels at the time, it feels like, oh, like I'll just connect with these people later or something, but it's really valuable to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's always great to take also some time out of work and get to know some new people that, you know, probably you'll see them in a couple of years doing some great work, and I don't know, they can at least host you at their place if you need a place to stay or something. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Is there any last advice or project that you would like to promote?
No projects that I would want to promote. I wish I could say that I had a new release of my little ASP.NET Core book, but I don't yet. It's been I've been too busy to update it. I hope I will be able to do it. Like maybe by the time that .NET 5 comes out. I would say like definitely I'm happy to connect with anybody here on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Just like if you want to connect on LinkedIn, just remind me that we connected on this webinar. As far as advice goes, I would say the best advice that I kind of wish someone else had given me when I was younger or just getting started was that kind of what I said before, one of the most valuable things you can do is to build something, even if it's really small, build something like all the way through. It's really, I think I've struggled with this. I think a lot of people struggle with this. It's extremely easy to get started on things. It's really, really hard to finish things. If I wasn't like disciplined with myself, I would start like 100,000 projects and probably like never finish them. Because it's really easy to get excited about something new and then it starts to get complicated or it's like less interesting or whatever. Pushing through and getting something actually published, again, like even if it's really small, is really, really valuable. I'll share one small anecdote where I didn't realize it was valuable at the time, but later it was. When I was a lot younger, I was like 16 or something, 17, I built this application, which I thought was going to be really, I thought it was something I'd be able to sell, like a small program that would help this very niche group of people that I thought would want to buy it. So I spent like all summer, I spent like 6 months working on this application, and I made the mistake of I didn't really do any user research. I just kind of assumed that people would want to buy this thing because I thought it would be valuable. So I built this whole thing. The long story short was that like nobody ever bought it. I think my mom bought a license to it and that's it. And so that was like really disappointing. I was like really sad because I was like, man, I spent so much time on this and like it was a total failure. But I did get the experience of building something all the way to, this was a desktop application way back in the day. So like I had to think about how do I update this thing and how do I have a support site for it and how do I like do billing and like I have to give somebody a license key to unlock it. How do I make sure someone can't steal that key, like all that stuff. So I spent a lot of time working on those things and ultimately like it felt like a failure because literally nobody bought it except for my mom. But then 4 or 5 years later, when I finished school and I was like going to interview for my very first job, I was sitting across the table from the CEO who's interviewing me, and he was like kind of a nice guy, but like very aggressive. And he was like, "So, like, you don't have very much experience. Like, why should I hire you for this job?" And I was like, "Well, I do have some experience building things on my own." He's like, "Well, like, tell me about it. What did you build?" So I just explained to him like, "Well, I built this thing, and I had to build like." Not just the application, but also this licensing system and this update system and all this stuff, like just walked him through like all the stuff I built for this failure of a project. And he was like, wow, that sounds really good. And he hired me. And what I was working on there had nothing to do with that project that I built, but the fact that I could explain something that I had, that I had built all the way to production and had thought about all the things, all the problems that you have when you get to like production on some application, it impressed him and he gave me the job. So that was like, at the time I would have told you like, man, it was such a horrible feeling of failure to like, spend all this time and this never came to anything, but at least I finished it. And the fact that I finished it ended up being valuable for me later too.
Great. So now you've heard finishing your projects or making small projects and just going through the full cycle is extremely beneficial, not only for you to learn, but also to start building a portfolio of the work that you've done.
Yes.
and being able to share that can improve your possibilities to get a job opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Nate, for also taking the time and just talk a little bit about your life, your company, and Oauth and authentication in general.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nate, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thank you all amazing campus experts for joining today and taking also time to listen to these words of advice.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was great to chat.
Okay. Have a